Good morning, and thank you so much for having me. It is a great honor to speak to you today. You have a fabulous program ahead of you for the rest of this semester, and I'm honored to help you start it off. So as was described, I'm Frank Rimalovski. I am the executive director, as it says here, which means I run the entrepreneurship program at New York University in New York City. We are the largest private university in the world in the U.S. with over 55,000 students, many of whom I have the privilege and opportunity to work with every day to help them start startups. We run an innovation fund that makes investments in startups. We have an entrepreneurship center and many, many programs, but that's not what I'm here to tell you about. What I do want to talk about is how we do this in New York and in the U.S. I'm not here to tell you that everybody does everything this way, but we believe these are the best practices. Another way to think about this talk is, where do you start with a startup? Or as I like to say, so I've got a big idea, now what? Right? It's not just about having an idea, but actually bringing that idea to reality in a way that actually solves a pressing or meaningful customer problem. So what I want to talk about for however much time I have today is to break some of the mythology around startups. I find amongst both students and faculty, as well as those outside of universities, often have this magical view of how startups really work. And I want to teach you or share with you some of the best practices that you can actually begin to apply immediately. Okay? We're big believers in experiential or applied entrepreneurship. Much like becoming a surgeon or even learning how to play poker, it is something you need to practice immediately, not just read about. And at its core, it's about learning how to identify and solve and validate your customers' most pressing problems. But it's often not just about figuring out how to put your idea into the market, but looking at what is the problem that you're solving underneath that idea, developing greater understanding around it, and then figuring out what is the best way to solve it. And we'll talk more about that. Now, why is that so important? Well, the sad fact is that the vast majority, in fact, over 75% of startups that raised venture capital in the US fail. Okay, that's sad. But it's sad both for the entrepreneurs, it's even sadder for their investors, who often lose all of their money in the process. And these are just the ones that were able to raise venture capital, right? That means the number of startups that try and never even get to raise venture capital, the number would be even higher. But why is it that so many fail? There's lots of discussion around this all over the world. This was a study that was done by a firm called CB Insights in New York City, and they looked at over 200 startups and interviewed those founders of those startups that failed. And I'm not going to go through all of these examples. They came up with the 20 reasons, but I do want to focus on the top two. The second one says that they ran out of cash. Almost 30% indicated that they ran out of money. But if you are in a major startup hub, particularly in a place like New York City or Silicon Valley, there is plenty of money. Okay, there is no shortage of money. Okay, but if you're not able to raise that money, okay, it's probably an indication that there was some deficiency in that business. Okay, rather than simply running out of money. If it was a good business, there's a good chance those entrepreneurs would have been able to attract that money. Which gets to the first point, which is that there was no market need. 42% of founders said that they built something that the market didn't want or didn't want enough of. And that, I believe, is infinitely preventable. And that's really what I want to spend the rest of this talk talking about. Right? So it's about, as I mentioned at the beginning, it's about getting to understand those users, your customers. This is a quote from Paul Graham, the founder of Y Combinator. He said, "Starting a startup is something you can only learn intrinsically by doing it. And what you need to learn is the needs of your own users." Okay? And the answers to those questions about what are the needs of your users are outside of the building, literally and figuratively speaking. Okay, it's because I'm sure you're all smart. You have all gotten into this prestigious university and this prestigious program, but you are not smarter than the collective intelligence of your customers and of the market. And this is not something you can simply learn by Googling it or reading blogs or reading research reports or even books on startups, right? And experts are often overrated. An industry expert is an N of one. It is one data point. Okay, you need to get that collective intelligence, maybe of those experts, but more importantly of your customers. And you need to get literally out of the building and talking to those customers while you're doing that. And you need to do that before you finish designing and or building your product. It's not about going out and doing early sales. It's about getting out of the building and doing what we call early customer discovery. Right? This is Thomas Edison, the great American inventor and entrepreneur. And he said that time is really the only capital that any human being has, and it is the thing that they can least afford to waste or lose. Okay? And as an entrepreneur, if you're just getting started, you probably don't have a lot of money or any other resources or assets, but you do have your time. And you want to use that not just judiciously, but you want to use it efficiently and focus it on the things that matter and that will have the most impact on the success of your startup. So in terms of how to start a startup, it's really about getting that substantial customer feedback before you finish building and launching your product so that you launch products that customers actually want. Not what you think they want, not what you hope they want, not what you believe that they want, but that you actually know because you've put yourself in your customer's shoes. And this will enable you to launch that startup more successfully, more quickly, and more cheaply or affordably. Okay, so it's about maximizing the resources that you have at hand. Okay, so startups are about teams, right? That we often hear about the founder CEO. All startups had a team at the beginning, a team of typically or often multidisciplinary folks who bring different skills and perspectives to their startup. It's about starting with stating your hypotheses, doing customer discovery, and then building prototypes to test and validate those further, and then using evidence to drive your decisions. And that's what I want to spend the rest of this time talking about, is this approach of evidence-based entrepreneurship. And I contrast that with faith-based entrepreneurship, where you hope and believe and pray that you get it all right. Okay, but rather making those decisions based on evidence. Who in the room has a background in science or engineering? Okay, okay, that's what I was hoping. I was nervous for a second, no one raised their hand, right? Right, just as in the lab, you wouldn't base decisions based on your instinct or on faith. Right? You'd want evidence as you're running your experiments to make those decisions and establish those theories. It's very similar to the way we apply the scientific method in the lab to business, and that's really what the lean startup is about. Okay? So we used to think that startups were simply a smaller version of a large company, and everything we did to mimic the way that we organized and planned and even financed startups. Did it the way that bigger companies did it. But what we realized about 10 or 15 years ago is that startups and established companies, they don't even have to be big, but startups and established companies are fundamentally different. Okay, an established company knows who its customers are, know what they value, know how to sell to them, know what they're willing to pay, and so on. As a startup, you don't. You simply don't know the answers to those questions. Okay, so startups are in search mode. Okay, you're searching for the answers to those questions, whereas established companies can execute on those known knowns, who their customers are, what they value, and so forth. Right? So established companies, okay, can start with a business plan and a financial model, right? You'd write up a 20 or 40-page document, come up with a spreadsheet that was so detailed, all the numbers didn't even fit into it, right, to predict your 5-year growth plans for your business. Okay, but that's great for an established company with an established customer base and an established product, but for a startup, that makes no sense. Okay? Scott Cook, the founder of Intuit, which makes Quicken and TurboTax and all these other financial products, said, for every one of our failures, we had spreadsheets that looked awesome. Okay, because essentially writing a business plan for a startup is an exercise in creative writing. It's a work of fiction. Okay, and I like facts. I prefer nonfiction. Right? So I'm not here to teach you or tell you that you as a startup should be coming up with a 5-year financial model or writing a detailed business plan. Okay, but that doesn't, I'm sorry. My favorite startup philosopher, the great boxer Mike Tyson, once said, everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face. Okay, and that's a little bit what starting a startup is like, in that you cannot predict with any certainty how the market or your customers or your competitors are going to react to your entry into the market. Okay, so that's why we don't write 5-year business plans for a nascent startup. Okay, but that doesn't mean that we don't plan. Okay, rather I want to talk about the planning that comes before the plan. Okay, the great American general Dwight Eisenhower, before he became president of the United States, said, in preparing for battle, I've always found that plans are useless, but planning is indispensable. And that's the way I want you to think about this. We want to do planning, okay, not just write the plan. And the tool that we like to use at NYU is something called the Business Model Canvas. Who here has seen this before? Okay, a few of you. So the Business Model Canvas is a tool that was created by a Swiss academic named Alex Osterwalder. It was actually his PhD thesis about a decade ago. And I love the Canvas because its power lies in its simplicity. On this one page, and it doesn't need to be this big, you can do this on an A4 piece of paper as well. It captures all the key elements that define your business model. Who are your target customers? What's the value that you're delivering to them? How will you get your product to them physically, but also how will you acquire them as customers? How do you make money? And so on. Okay, and on this one page, you can see how all of these elements interact, versus when you write it out in long form, it's what's on page 1 and what's on page 3 is maybe out of sight and out of mind. Okay? But the goal is to use, not just to fill out the canvas with your business, but to use it as a scorecard of sorts. It's a way to keep track of what you're learning as you're getting out of the building and talking to your customers and validating and invalidating those assumptions. So before I dive into that more, how do we do this? I'm sorry. Before we dive into how do we do this, I want to answer the question of what is a business model. Okay, the business model is how all of these elements come together to create value for your business while creating value for your customers. Okay, so it's the interaction of all these. So it's bigger than just the revenue model. It's bigger than how you make money. Okay, when we use the term business model, right, it answers the question of who are your initial target customers? Okay, what is it that they value? Why will they buy or use your product or service? How will you get, keep, and grow those customers? How will you acquire them, retain them, and increase the value that you're providing them over time? Right? It helps answer the question, what is your channel strategy? How will you sell your product? Right? What is your revenue model? How will you make money? Are you selling a physical product? Are you licensing something? Is it a subscription? Is it a freemium? Lots of different potential sources for that. What are the partnerships you need to start? What can you outsource? What does your team need to be really good at? Right? And what are the assets that you need? This is a lot of questions, but these are really fundamental to any business. Okay? And I would want, as an investor, I would want to know the answers to these questions before I invested my money or even my time into one of these companies. Right? So, as I mentioned, the goal is not just to fill out the canvas, right? But we'll capture our hypotheses in them. Okay, and you may have multiple hypotheses for some elements of the canvas. And if you have multiple customers, as illustrated by my very clever color coding scheme here, right, you will, by definition, have multiple hypotheses for different parts of your business model. Okay? Now, you can also think about the business model as helping you define the 3 key elements for any business, right? Is it desirable? Is there a market for what you're creating? Right? That's what we think about as this upper right quadrant of the canvas. Right? Is it feasible? Do you have the skills and the assets and resources that you need to execute on it? And is it economically viable? Right? Is there a potential business where the revenue can at least at some point in the future exceed your costs? If it's not, you don't have a business. Okay? Even in a not-for-profit, your revenue at least has to equal your expenses. Okay? So the problem is when you're getting started as an entrepreneur with a business model canvas full of assumptions, the sad truth is more than half of your assumptions are wrong. And I'm not saying that just based upon my intuition. We have data that suggests for entrepreneurs across the globe, on average, 60% of your assumptions are going to be wrong. Okay, and there's a very good chance that one or more of those has the potential to kill your business if you don't figure it out. So what lean is not about saving money, but it's about minimizing waste. And again, time is your most precious resource that you can afford to waste. So this is about figuring out, turning those assumptions into facts as quickly and cheaply and inexpensively as you can. Okay, and so the way we do that, which was defined by my colleague Steve Blank in his book called The 4 Steps to the Epiphany, he outlined something called the customer development methodology that is at the core of the lean startup. Okay, and Steve is an entrepreneur who has started and worked in 8 different startups, many successes, but as he also will admit, many failures. And those failures taught him a lot of the lessons that helped define this successful model. Right, and so as I mentioned earlier, right, an established company where you have a set of facts, of known knowns, it's fine to shift in execution mode. But as a startup, we need to start in search mode. And just as we would apply the scientific method diligently in the lab, right, we want to apply it with some diligence and rigor for our business. And so we start with the process that we call customer discovery. And this is where you test your assumptions, test those hypotheses with your customers by actually getting out of the building and speaking with them and interviewing them and asking them open-ended questions and learning more about them. Okay, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. Okay? Then, once we fully understand the problem that we're solving and who has it, right, we use that to inform the solution that we may ultimately create, and then we can go and test that solution. We do that repeatedly and iteratively, pivoting along the way. And a pivot is not a complete restart of your company. It's a simple change in one or more of your hypotheses in your business model. Okay, and we do that repeatedly until we have established a set of facts that we are then ready to begin executing on. Okay? So another way to think about it is in customer development, we first want to focus on testing the problem and then focus on testing the solution. Now, it's not enough to simply validate that your customers have the problem. This is something I came up with I call the customer commitment curve. And on the this axis, we have risk, right? And on this axis, we have customer commitment. Okay, the time zone difference is starting to catch up with me. And hopefully, it's fairly intuitive that we want our risk to go down over time as we're starting our startup. Right? Very risky at start, but we want to decrease that risk by turning those hypotheses into facts. Okay? But it's not as simple as that, right? It's one thing to know that your customers actually have a problem, It's another thing to know that they desire a solution to that problem. It's another thing to actually know that they're actually seeking a solution, right? Who here wishes they could eat healthier? Raise your hand. Okay? Who here is actually doing something about it? Okay? Who here is actually buying something to do something about it? Right? Okay, even less of you. Okay? And that's what we're talking about here, right? So having the problem is one thing, seeking a solution is another. Willing to use your solution and pay for your solution is yet another thing. Right? And that's really what we're looking to do, is to actually decrease that risk over time. Okay? And do that as quickly and inexpensively as possible. Right? Okay, so I want to break down some elements of the business model canvas for you. And I'm going to focus primarily on your value proposition and your customer segment, because this is really at the heart of your business. Right? Because your business exists to satisfy or serve the needs of your customer. Right? So it should be centered around them and the value you're creating for them. And even though the canvas doesn't look like it, these two boxes here are the foundation of your business. Right? So the value proposition answers the question, what are the benefits your customer can expect from your product or service? Benefits, not features. Right? So some key questions you need to think about include, what is the problem? Like literally, what is the problem that you are solving for your customer? Okay, why is this problem so hard to solve? Why does your solution not exist today? Okay, and don't believe your own hype that it's just because no one ever thought of it before. Okay, that may be true, but maybe it's hasn't been technically possible before. Maybe now is the right time to do it. Okay, or maybe the customers don't actually want it. I don't know. You need to figure that out. Right? That said, they are probably solving the problem in some way. Okay, and it may not be with a directly competitive solution. It may be using a different technical approach. But there probably is a solution, and you need to understand that. And I'll do a little case study about that in a bit. You want to understand who is delivering that solution. Okay, and what potential is there for you to either carve out a new piece of that market or to create a new market. Right? And if you are solving this problem for them, how much better do you have to solve it? Right? If I told you there was a new laptop out that was 1% faster, you'd be like, big deal. But if I said there's one that's 1,000% faster and 50% cheaper, you'd be curious. You'd want to know more about that. Right? So as they say, size matters. Right? And how big is the problem? How many people have it? Is it a small market? Is it a big market? Is it growing? Is it shrinking? These things all really matter. Right? And some of you may be thinking, well, where does my technology come in? And the truth is, your customers really don't care about your technology. This is something you really have to wrap your head around. Okay? They are trying to solve a problem. Okay? Your technology is only one piece of the solution that will solve that for them. Okay? You need to think about the entirety of your business model. So customer discovery is about unpacking that problem, figuring out who might have it most acutely or severely and is desperately in need of that problem, right? We like to talk about a hair on fire problem, right? Where a brick may be an inappropriate solution for it, but if it's the only thing you have, you're going to use it to put out that fire, okay? But then figuring out what is the optimal way to solve it, okay? Not just about force-fitting your idea into your customer's hands. Okay, another way to think about this was popularized by an author and academic in the US named Clay Christensen. He's a professor at the Harvard Business School. And in his book, The Innovator's Dilemma, he talked about the notion of jobs to be done. What is it that your potential customer is trying to get done? And the canonical example that he talked about was a drill. He said the truth is that people don't want to buy a 1/4-inch drill. Okay, what they want is they want to create a quarter-inch hole. And understanding the context of what it is your customer is trying to get done and why they're trying to get done, rather than just the what, right, which is the solution. Focus on the why, not just the what or the how, okay, and understanding that. Okay, and now that's talking about a functional benefit is the term that we like to describe it, right, is what is the tool or the solution actually do for the customer, right? But it's a little bit more complex than that. If I want to buy a car, and let's say I'm thinking about a Tesla, right? I might be thinking, you know, I want to be able to travel moderate length distances easily, okay? But the truth is, within a given budget, almost any car can do the same functional jobs for you of getting you there safely and securely and fast enough, right? Though the Tesla does offer certain other functional benefits of power and acceleration and lower maintenance and all that, okay? But there are also emotional and social jobs that I might be trying to get done, right? How does that car make me feel? How does driving a Tesla make me feel? Right? And the environmental impact is something that actually might appeal to me emotionally. Right? I feel good about driving a car that's consuming less energy or polluting less. Okay, that's an emotional job for me. But there's also a social job. Right? How does that car convey my social status to people around me? Right? And the car companies understand this very well. They play to our emotional and social needs as much as they play to our functional needs. Okay, but this is not just true in cars, and it's not just true in consumer products. It's true in business as well. It's true in healthcare. It's true in every sector. And unpacking these emotional and social jobs are critical. Because remember, and we'll talk more about this, businesses are not buying your products. People are. And even when those people are working in a business, can really good salespeople know how to play to those emotional and social jobs that their customers are trying to get done? Right? So you really want to put yourself in your customers' shoes. Get to know them, the way they think, their preferences, their priorities, their needs, their pains and gains that they seek. Okay, so your customer, we've been talking about customers. I've been talking about customers. But I want you to really focus on thinking about who's going to be your initial target customer. Right? Who are going to be the first 500, 5,000, maybe 500,000, depending on your market segment, right? What problem are they trying to get solved? Right? Another classic business book called Crossing the Chasm, written by a guy named Jeffrey Moore 20 or 30 years ago, introduced this notion of the technology life cycle adoption curve. And in it, he showed the trajectory that all new products and technologies take when entering the market. And he had the data to back this up. I'll spare you that today. And in it, he observed how all companies are trying to ultimately get at the mainstream market, whatever that is for your segment, right? The big, growing market. The problem is that the needs of the mainstream market are actually quite diverse. Right? The mainstream market is comprised of many smaller subsegments, each that may have unique needs, functional, emotional, and social, different preferences, different priorities. As a startup, it's really hard, if not impossible, to try to serve the needs of the mainstream market. So we believe that you should be focusing on this segment, the enthusiasts, or your early adopters, or your beachhead market. These are the people that have that hair on fire problem. They're dissatisfied with the status quo, looking for a better solution, and they want it now. Okay? These are the people that are going to make your business successful, because if you don't get through your enthusiasts, or whatever you want to call them, you're not going to get to that second sector, or that third sector, or that fourth sector, and achieve that larger market penetration that you're ultimately seeking. right? You probably all remember this company that used to be very popular called Facebook, right? Who were Facebook's first customers? Students. Be more specific than students. Be more specific than university students. Harvard students. Whoever said that, you get a cookie. Okay? Harvard students. There were 10,000 of them back in 2004. That sounds like a terrible little small market. Okay? But they crushed that market. They owned that market. They got 90% of Harvard students using Facebook within, I believe, 2 months. And something like 65% of them were using it every day. Okay, that is owning a market. And then they use that as a launching point to introduce it to Columbia University, Stanford University, and Yale. Okay, and then they went to the rest of the Ivy Leagues. And then they went to all four-year college students in the US. And then they expanded abroad. And then high school students started using it. And today, our grandparents are using it. Okay, but that took almost 10 years for that to happen. Okay? Facebook's already 15 years old. Okay, maybe they're somewhere down here, okay, where this axis is the market penetration. Okay, but as they expanded their market, their value proposition changed as well. Okay, when they first started, it was about figuring out was he or she single or not. Okay, when I started using it, maybe 6 years later, it was about sharing photos with your friends and keeping on top of the news. And today it's about fake news and other things. But the point is that as their customer segment grew, their value proposition evolved and grew as well. Okay, another example, right? Who wants a combined phone, internet browsing, and mail device with no copy and paste, no physical keyboard, only supports 2G data speeds, no support for corporate email, brace yourself, no front-facing camera, no third-party applications, and it only works on one carrier, and only in the US, and only on AT&T, who's terrible. Okay? Well, that was the original iPhone. Okay? And while it seems like the iPhone was an overnight success, it also was not. Okay? In the first year, now granted, Apple was an established company, but in the first year, only a couple million people bought the iPhone. Who were those people? They were enthusiasts. They were people who were already Apple customers, who loved their iPod, but also hated carrying around multiple chargers and multiple devices. Okay? But over time, they expanded their value proposition. They introduced the App Store. They added 3G support, face recognition, all the other stuff that we all now know about today. And as a result, their market penetration grew. But those enthusiasts stood in line back in 2007 to get that device. And they were all existing Apple customers. Okay? Then the visionaries came on a little bit later, and then the pragmatists. And today, I'm sorry, I apologize, this chart's out of date. We're in year 11, I think, and they're selling 250 million of them. Okay, now is that curve going up and to the right or down and to the right? I don't know. Okay, but they're in the mainstream market, but they started with this teeny little market. Okay, what is that for your business? And what's my point? I have two. Okay, one is as a startup, you're not capable of serving the mainstream market. So find that beachhead or that early adopter that will eagerly embrace your half-baked product that you can serve with your small staff, non-existent sales and marketing budget. Brian Chesky, the founder of Airbnb, said, "I'd rather have 100 people that love me than 1,000 people who kind of like me." Okay, you want to find those 100 people who love you, right? The second point, right, as I talked about in Facebook, right, there's no point in building the business or even the product that you're going to need when you have those millions of users and are serving the mainstream market. right? If Facebook tried to ship the Facebook of today out of their dorm room at Harvard, they never would have gotten there. And it would have been, either they never would have shipped it, or people wouldn't have understood what it was for. Same thing with the iPhone, which technically probably wasn't even possible to build back then in terms of the current one. Right? So optimize your product for that immediate stage of growth. Okay, of where you are today and in the very near future. Right? Because your product or service offering will evolve over time. The great startup philosopher Yoda once said, "The key to success I know not, but trying to please everyone, the key to failure is." He didn't really say that, but I love that. I love attributing this to him. Okay? Okay, the second point on customers I want to make is, or actually the second point and the third point, right? You may be thinking that a large, company like a Tesla is your customer, or a hospital, or maybe an NGO or not-for-profit organization, or maybe a university, or even the government. My government, your government, whoever, right? But actually, none of those organizations are customers. Okay? Customers are people. Okay, you need to figure out who are the people inside of those organizations that are going to be your customers, right? Are they a doctor? If so, what kind of doctor? What is their role in using or purchasing your product, right? Maybe they're a high school principal, right? Maybe they're the patient, the scientist, or any of these people, right? But they're all unique, different individuals with different roles and trying to get different jobs done, as we talked about earlier. Right? Oh, don't forget the maintenance guy. Okay? Right? And so you want to get to know each of these people and define who is your customer archetype. Who are they? What is their position, their title? Does their gender matter? Does their age matter? It may or may not. Okay? More importantly, probably, what are they trying to get done in their job or in their life? How and where do they buy? Do they have a discretionary budget either in their head or on paper for that? Right? If I told you I sell a delicious new beverage and it's $20 a serving, you'd want to know what's in it or what it does for me. But you'd say, well, that's outside of my budget, even though you actually don't keep a budget for your drinking habits. Maybe you do. I don't. Right? What matters to these customers? What motivates them? Right? Think about that Tesla customer. Are they buying it just to save the environment, or are they doing it to show off their status? Are they doing it for the power and the speed? What are their motivations? And who influences them? Who do they read? Who do they listen to? Right? Because ultimately you want to get to a day in the life of your customer and understanding where your product or service fits in to them. Okay, this will help you design the product to work within their life, their world, their constraints, but also help you understand how to sell and market to them as well. Right? So when we talk about your customer, right, most people are thinking about this guy, your user, the person who actually touches or uses your product each day. Right? But it's more complicated than that. There's often the user, in the case of Bart wanting to buy a comic book, right? But we know Homer is the economic buyer. He's the one who's paying for it. And he may have a role in the decision-making process. Right? But it's more than that. And if you'll pardon the pun, there's a whole cast of characters you need to consider. Right? So Bart may have a friend who likes to pick his nose and tell him what comics he should read. Right? The recommender may be the guy at the store, in this case, comic book guy. That's actually his name in the show, right? Who recommends things or promotes things to him or asks him what he's looking for and then tries to help find that solution. Right? We all know in the Simpsons family, Marge is the decision maker and wears the pants. Homer is the economic buyer. But then we also have lovely little Lisa Simpson, who is our saboteur, right? Who doesn't want Bart to get that comic book. Why? Why doesn't Lisa want Bart to get the comic book? Just because? Because she's a vindictive sister? Okay, that's possible. But it may also be the family has a finite budget and she wants that money spent on saxophone lessons or something for her. Okay, now this is a silly example, but it's a very valid example for any business, right? These different roles are all your customer. So you need to think about creating an archetype for each one of them. And this is a simple comic book. If you're selling into healthcare or into any enterprise market, right, you're going to have a very complex customer ecosystem. Right? If you were selling a drug, okay, to your patient, right, you might have a government authority. In the US, we call it the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, has to approve each drug. They're the official recommender, right? The decision maker may be the doctor. The economic buyer is the insurance company or the government insurance program, right? The saboteur may be your competition or the doctor or nurse or whoever whose job may not be necessary once your drug treats all those patients. Maybe they don't want that product to come to market, right? So all these people are your customers. Okay, so when I use the term customer, I want you to think about that ecosystem of people. And that you need to understand, satisfy, and appeal in order to get them to buy or use your product. Right? So every one of them is ostensibly a roadblock to get to BART. And you need to understand what are their interests and motivations. Okay? The insurance company is going to be looking for efficacy and things that will save them money relative to the other standards of care. Right? The doctor just knows that it works and that it's going to treat the patient's needs. Right? The FDA wants to know that it's safe. It's going to not do more harm than good. Right? Different needs for different people in your customer ecosystem. Okay. Quick case study. Some students that I was working with 8 or 9 years ago now had developed what was called a hemostatic gel, which is a fancy way of saying something that stops bleeding. Okay, and it actually was pretty amazing stuff. Actually, the student developed it as a freshman. It was a natural plant-derived polymer that could stop bleeding in 3 seconds. And it really worked. They were cutting themselves in the lab to prove it. I didn't recommend that, but they did it anyway. Okay, and so they thought that this was going to be a great solution, and it was going to be in every first aid kit in the world. Okay, the problem was that it was not cheap initially. I forget exactly how much a syringe of it would cost, but let's say, it was $10 an application initially, because their manufacturing costs were very high at the beginning. Well, I don't know about you, but I'm not going to spend $10, when I have a little finger cut. Okay? And when I asked them about who their competition was, they said, oh, we don't have any. I said, really? So if I went up to a hospital, there are just people bleeding all over the place because there's no way to stop the bleeding? No. How do we stop bleeding today? Gauze and pressure, right? It doesn't even have to be a piece of gauze. It could be a tissue. Toilet paper. You put it on the cut and you press it, and hopefully it clots and you stop bleeding. That works most of the time. Okay? And you put a Band-Aid over it and you're good to go. What's the problem with gauze and pressure relative to their solution? What's the problem for this company, Cressalon? It's really cheap. It's almost free. I bet you most hospitals pay less than a penny for a piece of gauze, and the pressure is free. Okay? Their product was not free. It did not cost a penny. So that caused them to pivot, fortunately, before they actually launched their product, and to look for where was there a high-value need to stop bleeding in 3 seconds, where $10 might be nothing. And they learned from talking to doctors and ultimately with surgeons that there were certain types of internal bleeds that happened during surgery that you cannot stop easily with gauze and pressure, and where it could be a matter of life and death. And so they started to pivot to these certain classes of surgeons as their customers, and these certain type of bleeds that they could stop. Side story, they learned then about, in the US, it requires Food and Drug Administration approval. Okay, so it wasn't even going to, they couldn't even use it on humans if they wanted to. But that led to another insight that they learned that, oh, in the veterinarian market, where we treat animals, dogs, cats, horses, whatever, right, that it is very lightly regulated, but they have that same problem. And they could do a study to validate the efficacy and safety of their solution and then sell it into that market. And that's how Vetigel became their first product. And the veterinarian market became their first customer. Okay? They never would have figured that out if they weren't out there talking to customers, again, before they actually sold their first vial of this product. Saved them a ton of time and a ton of money and a ton of agony. So they had raised that money to try to launch into the first aid market or the human surgical market, right? They would have failed. And they might have failed beyond repair, meaning where they may have exhausted all their money, all their time, and all their resources. They figured this out in a matter of months. Okay? So validating the need at the outset is the single most cost-effective way for you to minimize the risk and increase the likelihood of success for your venture. Right? So the goal here is to get to what I like to call problem-solution fit. And that's the tight alignment between that initial customer segment and their needs and the value that you create for them. Right? So, right? We've now figured out who you're selling to and what pain point you're solving for. You're ready to start building and selling, right? Well, not so fast. Right? We've only talked about these two boxes of the canvas. We haven't talked about how you're going to acquire them, how you're going to sell, how you're going to make money, and all that. Right? You can't have a valid business until you test the three sides of the canvas we talked about earlier. Is it desirable? Is it feasible? And is it economically viable? Right? So I'm just going to really quickly, right? The channel talks about how your products get to your customers. Your customer relationships talk about how you get to keep and grow those customers. Your revenue stream talks about how you make money. Your key activities is what are the things that your business has to excel at? What do you need to be really, really good at? Which actually, a colleague likes to say that's the first derivative of building your team. Right? What are the key resources or assets that your business needs to execute its business model? And then what can you outsource? Who are your key partners and suppliers? And then how does that all come together in a cost structure? Okay? But remember, they're only hypotheses at this point. I say hypotheses because we're in an institute of higher learning, but what we really mean is guesses. Okay? Right? So again, we're going to use customer development to test your assumptions about your customer needs and problems first and use that to inform what is the ultimate solution that you want to create for them. Right? So now you know how to start a startup. Okay? It's about getting that customer feedback before building and launching your product so you can build things that you know they want, that you know they're willing to buy, you know how much they're willing to spend, and so on. Right? Some other resources I can recommend if this is interesting. My colleague Steve Blank does a great self-paced free course on Udacity that you could probably do in a matter of days if you did nothing else, but you can do it over a couple of weeks, called How to Build a Startup. And then my colleague Giff Constable and I put together a book that's free for academic use. You all qualify, called Talking to Humans. It's a book about the tips, tricks, and traps of doing customer discovery. How to actually find those customers and successfully conduct those interviews and make sense of what you learn. And you can download that for free at talkingtohumans.com. All right? With that, I'm happy, if we have time, I'm happy to take any questions, or we can move on.